What's going on, guys? It is Wyatt, and I know it has been quite some time since I uploaded this channel, so I apologize for that. But today I'm bringing you the first part to a multi-video series of assembling a 1200 horsepower Duramax engine. So let's roll the intro and jump right into things.
Y'all want some fucking cheeseburgers?
Before we go balls deep into this very expensive Duramax engine here behind me, I want to answer a couple of questions for my OG subscribers. A lot of you guys have been wondering where I have been lately, why I haven't been uploading, and it's pretty simple. You guys know that I run my own diesel repair shop. I'm the only employee here. So when I get busy, I get really busy, and that's where I've been the last 3 months, just playing catch up, getting everything done. If you still don't believe me, I'll show you kind of a cool project I got coming in next week. This guy right here is an 8.3 liter Cummins C engine that I'm putting in a Peterbilt this next week. Also building a set of custom compounds for the truck. So yeah, if you don't believe me, that's all the proof you should need. But anyways, aside from that, I've also been getting a lot of questions whether I'm still in the Honda game or what's going on with any of the Honda stuff, since that's what a lot of you guys know me for. And while the Hondas were super fun and I had a blast with them over the past 3 years, I'm no longer in the Honda game. In the last video, we sold the 10-second turnkey race car, and I also ended up selling the red EG hatch that I had and decided to actually do the truck project. So if you guys want a kind of a hint of what project we're going to be doing, go back and check that video out. I give you guys a little bit of info on what this 1200 horsepower Duramax engine is actually going into. And with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into this series showing you how to build a 1200 horsepower Duramax engine. So while we get everything pulled down off the shelf, a couple of quick things to let you guys in on is this is an LB7 based engine build. It's pretty similar for all 01 to 10 trucks, so your LB7 all the way to LMM build is all going to be fairly similar and use most of the same parts with a few exceptions here and there. Another thing is, in this video, all we are doing is a parts overview, so I'm going to kind of walk you guys through why I chose the parts that I did and how they're going to benefit the build. So let's go ahead and start getting these things unboxed and kind of talking you guys through what we have chosen. Honestly, I could stare at these beautiful parts all day long. It's actually pretty amazing that sitting on this countertop right now is about $10,000 worth of Duramax Go Fast parts. So yeah, there's that. Next up, we're going to separate all of the parts out, go over them one by one, and I will explain to you why I chose the parts that I did, and if I had everything to do over, a couple of the parts that I would change. So first up is the meat and potatoes of any engine build, and that is the engine block itself. This guy here is nothing fancy. It is just an LB7 block that I got with about 120,000 miles on it. I then took it over to the machine shop, had them deck each side, both the left and right, 3/1000ths to get a nice clean mating surface, and then had them bore the cylinders 20/1000ths over, as well as match my pistons for the correct piston to wall clearance. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I also had them deck the bottom of this block because we are going to be running a girdle. Also, more about that later. And it will also be getting a fresh set of bearings. Other than that, this block is pretty much untouched and nothing super fancy. Right now, this engine block should be pretty stout for the 1200 horsepower that I'm shooting for, but if I was planning to go over that, there's definitely a couple other things I would do to this stock block to make it live a little bit longer life. The first thing is filling all the cooling jackets with concrete. That really helps to strengthen up the bottom end of these things, and the bottom end rigidity is key to making these things last. So the concrete filled sleeves definitely helps, but for what I'm doing, I don't think I'm going to need them, and I kind of want to run a wet block for now. One other thing I would do to this block if I was shooting for more than that 1200 horsepower goal is something called O-ringing, and that is where you go in and cut a small groove around every cylinder and then install a stainless steel wire into that groove. And what that's going to do is give it a lot more bite into the head gasket and help alleviate any pressurizing of the cooling system, whether that's from lifting the head or just blowing out a head gasket. That O-ring is going to help control that. The biggest factor of that is just the super high cylinder pressure that these things have when they're making that kind of horsepower. At the goal of 1200 horsepower, I really should O-ring this block just for that extra clamping force. Unfortunately, all of the machine shops around me, I don't really feel comfortable enough with having them do them just because none of them have really done the O-ring on the Duramax. So I went ahead and skimped out on that for this build and just upgraded the head studs, but we'll talk about those more later. So let's go back over to the bench and start looking at the parts that are going to start filling this thing up. Up next, we have the Wagler competition girdle. This is a really nice piece, and what we use this for is to keep all of our main caps from moving. It just adds a lot of stability to the bottom end of this engine, and that is key to making big power for a sustained amount of time. So it comes with the girdle here, comes with the ARP main stud kit, and also new hardware for your oil pan, which is these outer bolts here, and also the side bolts for the main caps. So what you guys are looking at is the girdle installed on the block. This picture was taken at the machine shop when we were double checking for clearance issues. Now, I had mentioned earlier that there was a couple of things I wish I would have changed or done differently on this engine build, and the girdle kind of ties into one of the things that I would have changed, and that is using the factory main caps. So the factory main caps should be fine for our goal of 1200 horsepower, but it's also why I'm not going to be trying to make anything above that. And the biggest reason is the factory main caps will start to collapse in on themselves when you're making big horsepower such as this engine's going to. And as a result of that, the bearing inside of that cap will actually start to scrape the oil off of the crankshaft instead of using that oil as a cushion and a lubricant between the crank and the bearing. And when that happens, you can easily lose main bearings, spin main bearings, destroy a crank, all kinds of stuff. And that's never a good day, especially with parts this expensive. So on the left, we have a set of factory main caps, and on the right is a set of billet main caps. And just by looking at them, you can see there's a lot more meat on the billet main cap. They're also machined from a lot better material than the factory caps are, and all around just a better design, gonna really help alleviate those bearing issues that we had just mentioned. And if I had all the money in the world, it's definitely what I would have went with in this engine. The problem is I don't have a local machinist that I trust enough to do the aligned bore on this block when using those billet main caps. There's a lot of machine work that goes into making those work properly. So not only are you align boring all the main journals, which can lead to a bunch of issues, but you also have to maintain the correct spacing between the cam and crank gear because those are gear driven. So the alignment of those two has to be very precise as well. If I had the money, I would definitely just ship it out to either SoCal or Wagler or whoever and have them install the billet mains for this engine. But unfortunately, I just don't have the money to do that right now. So the factory main caps will have to do on this build, and if we blow it up or run into issues down the line, maybe that's something we will upgrade in the future. This behemoth here is our Callies Compstar crankshaft. There's a couple of reasons I chose to go with an aftermarket crankshaft rather than using the factory one. And the first reason is the factory crankshaft has a known issue of snapping the snout completely off so that you wind up with a two-piece design, which isn't exactly great. What happens is they break right back here behind the number 1 and 2 journal. So going with the aftermarket crankshaft should help alleviate some of that problem. Another thing that's nice with this Callies Compstar is it already comes with keyways in it. The factory crankshaft relies on tiny little 5mm dowel pins to hold the harmonic balancer up here, your oil pump gear, and your crank gear, whereas this guy uses a full key, and there's a lot less chance of those breaking. The only other thing about this particular crankshaft is it has already been balanced for my rotating assembly. So they take the weight of your pistons, rods, ring pack, flywheel, or flex plate technically, harmonic balancer, and then they put bob weights on this thing, spin it up, and they remove any weight or add weight where it's necessary to get this thing completely balanced out. That's what these holes back here are for. They ended up only having to remove weight from this crankshaft to get everything balanced out perfectly. So that is our Callies Compstar crankshaft. Let's go ahead and move on to our flex plate and harmonic balancer. So first up, we're going to talk about the flex plate. I ended up going with a billet piece from SoCal Diesel. Now there's a couple reasons you would go with an aftermarket flywheel such as this one. The first reason is this guy is SFI approved. So since we're going to be drag racing the new project, it's got to have that SFI certification. And the second reason is our factory flex plate on these engines are super common for coming apart, breaking, shattering, doing all kinds of very destructive damage. And the billet flex plate is going to resolve all that, and it's going to help us put a lot more of the power from the engine to the transmission. Whether it makes it to the ground from that point on, that's another story to be told in a later video. But yeah, super nice piece from the guys at SoCal Diesel. Sitting next to it is our harmonic balancer. This guy is an ATI SuperDamper. I've had great luck with ATI products in the past, and that is why I went with this one. What this guy is going to do is help remove any vibrations and harmonics left in the crankshaft. Even though we had everything balanced to each other, there is still going to be inherent vibrations and harmonics coming through that, and this guy is going to soak all those up and help that crank live a long and happy life. One quick side note is you may see this thing is stamped LBZ LMM. Our harmonic balancer is also for an LBZ LMM, and you may be asking yourself, why are you using that LBZ stuff if we are building an LB7 short block? And the answer is really simple. The Callies Compstar crankshaft comes pre-weighted for the LBZ LMM rotating assembly, as it's a little bit heavier than the LB7 LLY rotating assembly. So with going with these guys, it just makes it a lot easier to balance out the entire rotating assembly. In our case, it made it easy, and all we had to do was remove weight. I've heard some people say that if you go with the LB7 harmonic balancer and flex plate with a Callies crank, they actually had to add weight, and that becomes very expensive and time consuming. So if you're planning to go with a Callies Compstar crankshaft, even if you're building an LB7, make sure you go with the LBZ flex plate and harmonic balancer. So next up, we have our piston and rod combo. On the right side here, we have a Mahle forged piston. These guys are a 20 thousandths overbore. They have 75 thousandths valve pockets. They have a coated skirt and are going to give us a effective compression ratio of 16.5 to 1. So very nice piston from Mahle. This is another thing that I wish I would have changed if I had this all over to do again, but we'll touch on that more in a second. On the left, we have a Carrilo connecting rod. These are just their standard 7/16 fasteners and their standard rod. These are the lightest and strongest rods available for the Duramax according to Carrilo, and they're going to be plenty for what we need. These guys are actually complete overkill for 1,000 horsepower. They're definitely cheaper rods that you could run at that power level. So anyways, very nice rod. Those guys, very expensive, along with these pistons. These two together will set you back somewhere in the range of $4,000 to $5,000. So like I mentioned a second ago, the pistons are another area that I wish I would have gone a little bit different route than what I did. Not that this is a bad piston whatsoever. This thing's going to take all of the abuse we can throw at it and not even blink an eye. But the problem with a forged piston versus a cast piston is that the upper ringland on the forged piston is only a hard anodized coating, whereas on a cast piston, they can actually cast into the mold a steel upper ringland, and that steel upper ringland is going to take a lot more abuse than the straight up aluminum one on the forged piston. On the cast piston, you can easily get 100,000 miles out of the life of that piston because that steel upper ringland will take all of the abuse from the upper ring, as opposed to the forged piston that you're only going to see about 15,000 miles out of before it is completely useless. The problem is that steel upper ring will actually eat into the aluminum and completely destroy the upper ringland, and therefore you have a piston that is completely useless. Moral of the story is if you're building a competition use only engine, the forged piston is going to be a good option for you. While they are a bit more expensive, they're going to take a lot more power than a cast piston will. If it's something that you're going to be driving on the weekends or even daily driving, you're definitely going to want to stay away from the forged piston and go with a cast. The cast piston that I recommend is the Fingers Oval Bowl. Those things have been proven time and time again to take quite a bit of power and last quite a long time. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to some of the stuff in the top end of the engine. So moving our way to the top of the engine, first we'll look at our ARP head studs. These guys are a ARP 625 stud kit, and nothing too fancy here, just some nice head studs. You know you got the good shit when they come individually wrapped, unlike them poor boy 2000 studs that just come thrown in the box. Just playing, but I have had really good luck with the ARP hardware, so that's why we chose to go with them on the head studs. And the 625s should offer us a little bit extra clamping force versus the ARP 2000s, and that's why I decided to go with these. These guys are a little bit overpriced in my opinion. These will set you back about $1,500. Another piece we have from ARP is a harmonic balancer bolt. Nothing fancy there, just they are reusable versus the factory bolt that you need to replace every time you remove the bolt from the harmonic balancer. So I went ahead and pulled one of my cylinder heads out to explain the next couple of parts to you guys. This one is kind of convoluted, but stick with me. So on the left here we have a SoCal Diesel injector hold down kit. These are what hold the injector down into the cylinder head here. Now on the LB7, it's kind of the bastard child of the Duramaxes. They use these things called injector cups. And what this does is it slides down in the cylinder head right here and goes down and butts up in there against the bottom of the head. And the cooling jacket runs all the way around this guy, so around this cup here. On the top of the cup you have O-rings, and then on the bottom of the cup you rely on Loctite to keep this thing sealed to the bottom of the head. Now the problem with this is when you get to really high cylinder pressures, there is a tendency for the injector to move because it doesn't have enough clamping force, and then it lets the seal down here break, and that in turn releases pressure from your combustion chamber into the cooling system, which is never a fun time. So with this all assembled, like I said, this cup kind of goes down here in the head like so, and then your injector will sit down in there, and then it uses these hold downs that kind of bridge off of over here with a bolt in the middle of them to hold the injector and everything down into place. The factory ones are just known to not have enough holding power to get the job done, so that's why you go with these very nice billet pieces from SoCal Diesel. There are other options to alleviate this as well. They offer threaded injector cups. I'm not really a fan of them. I've heard too many stories of them failing, so that's why we just went with this really nice hold down kit. Next up we have our Duramax rocker stud kit. So as you can see here, we have 5 bolts that go in here, and these go up to a little kind of standoff thing that holds the rocker shaft across this guy. The factory bolts do an okay job, but when you're revving these things out really high, they have a tendency to break those. So we install these studs. They have a lot more holding power, and they're going to hold everything on the valve train a lot more stable and give us a lot better valve train control. One other very important part to this build is the Wagler dual valve spring and retainer kit. What these are going to do is help control the valves. The factory springs on these Duramax heads don't actually have a lot of seat pressure, and at very high RPM they will not get the valve closed in time, and you can end up smacking a piston with them. And since we're going to be revving this thing to about 4,500 or 5,000 RPM, it's crucial that we are able to get the valve closed and out of the way of the piston when it needs to be. Another thing you need to address when you are running a way heavier spring such as these is your push rods. These guys here are from Wagler Competition, and they are just a lot stronger than the factory ones are. Especially if you're going to be running a very high RPM with heavy valve springs. The factory ones have a tendency to bend, so these guys are just cheap insurance to make sure that none of that happens. And the last piece of the puzzle to do with valve train is this beauty here. This is a camshaft from Wagler Competition. It is their stage 2 alternate firing order cam, and long story short, all it's doing is rearranging the firing order on the Duramax to technically remove stress off of the snout of the crankshaft. So yeah, really nice piece. An added benefit of it is a higher lift and duration camshaft to allow more airflow into the engine. One other big plus about this camshaft is it is already keyed, as I had mentioned on the crank. These use a little 5mm dowel pin from the factory and have a tendency to break off, so going to a key gives you a lot more strength there and will not allow that gear to rotate separate of the camshaft. We've got just a couple more odds and ends here to touch on. This guy here is an oil pump from Wagler Competition. Nothing too fancy. It is a shimmed and pinned oil pump. The biggest problem with Duramax oil pumps is they like to spin on the shaft, so this gear will actually start to spin independently of the oil pump shaft, and that in turn gives you no oil pressure, which is no bueno. So what Wagler does is they take and cut a little hole through this gear and into the shaft, and then they install a little pin in there so that this guy cannot spin independent of each other, unless of course you break the pin, which is very rare. So very nice part there, and it's going to make sure that we have sufficient oil pressure at all times. Next, we have some Mahle head gaskets. These are wave stopper grade C head gaskets. They are pretty much the go-to for these Duramaxes, making bigger horsepower if you're just using a multi-layer steel gasket. So nothing fancy there. And lastly, we have a set of bearings for the engine. I'm going to go over these more in the next video, where we actually start measuring bearing clearances and assembling the bottom end of this engine. But we are running the Mahle Clevite bearings. These are their heavy duty kind of race application bearings, and they should serve their purpose just fine. So there you guys have it. That is the majority of the parts it takes to build a 1200 horsepower Duramax. Now obviously there's a lot more that goes into making that horsepower than what I showed you today, and we're going to be addressing all of that stuff in the upcoming videos in this series. So if you guys want to see that, make sure to subscribe down below and hit the little bell icon to join the notification squad. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, and if you made it all the way through this video listening to my dumbass ramble on, I appreciate it. With that being said, I guess that's it for this one, and in the next video we'll be assembling the bottom end of this thing. So thank you guys for watching, and we will see you later. Peace.